Education in Africa before the development of the European colonial schooling system. Educational practices in Africa consisted of groups of older people teaching aspects of life and rituals that would help girls and boys in adulthood. In some areas, education in early Africa included such things as artistic performances, ceremonies, games, festivals, dancing, singing and drawing. Boys and girls were taught separately to help prepare each sex for their adult roles. Every member of the community had a hand in contributing to the educational upbringing of the child. The high point of education experience in certain societies in Africa was the ritual passage ceremony from childhood to adulthood. When European colonialism and imperialism took place, it began to change many indigenous education systems. Schooling was no longer just about rituals and rites of passage. School would now mean earning an education that would allow Africans to compete with countries such as the United States and those in Europe. Africa would begin to try producing their own educated students as other countries had. Education participation rates in many African countries are low. Schools often lack many basic facilities, and African universities suffer from overcrowding and staff being lured away to Western countries by higher pay and better conditions. Participation. According to UNESCO's Regional Overview on Sub-Saharan Africa, in 2000 52% of children were enrolled in primary schools, the lowest enrollment rate of any region. UNESCO also reported marked gender inequalities. In most parts of Africa there is much higher enrollment by boys, in some there are more girls, due to sons having to stay home and tend to the family farm. Africa has more than 42 million children, almost half the school-age child population, receiving no schooling. Two-thirds of these are girls. The USAID Center reports that as of 2005, 40% of school-age children in Africa do not attend primary school, and there are still 46 million school-age African children who have never stepped into a classroom. The regional report produced by the UNESCO Breeder Education Sector Analyst Team in 2005 indicates that less than 10% of African children are now allowed in the system. 4 out of 10 children did not complete primary school in 2002-2003. So, 5 years after the World Education Forum and the adoption of the Millennium Goals, progress at primary level is far from decisive. The analysis highlights that principal efforts should be directed to reducing the number of dropouts per level. It appears also that geographical disparities or economic disparities are more significant and take longer to even out than gender disparities. From the quality point of view, studies such as SACMEQ and household surveys indicate very significant disparities in performance between and within countries. This report also shows that secondary and higher education enrollments have progressed proportionally more than primary enrollment over the period 1990 to 2002-2003, which questions the reality of policy priority given to primary education. The strong pressure for education continuity from the majority already benefiting from schooling explains this trend. To this must be added the weakness of mechanisms regulating pupil flow between the different levels of the education system. In 2005, the inventory and trends show a definitive risk of not reaching universal primary enrollment by 2015. 14.7% of the world's population is in Africa. The education systems inherited from the colonial powers were designed for the formal sector and public administration. However, ADEA has become aware of the informal sector's relevance in developing countries, and thus recognized the need for increased vocational school training as a way to help the informal sector. Challenges: language barriers due to high linguistic diversity, the legacy of colonialism and the need for knowledge of international languages such as English and French in employment and higher education. Most schooling in Africa takes place in languages that teachers and pupils do not speak natively, and in some cases simply do not understand. There is considerable evidence that pupils schooled in a second language achieve poorer results than those schooled in their mother tongue, as lack of proficiency in the second language impairs understanding and encourages ineffective rote learning. Although UNESCO have recommended since the 1950s that children be taught early literacy in their mother tongue, progressing later to other languages, not all African countries implement this effectively. Even where the earliest grades are taught in the mother tongue, pupils are typically forced to switch to languages such as English and French before acquiring proficiency in these languages. Lack of proper facilities and educators. Another reason for the low education rates in Africa is the lack of proper schooling facilities and unequal opportunity for education across countries. Many schools across Africa find it hard to employ teachers due to the low pay and lack of suitable people. This is particularly true for schools in remote areas. Most people who manage to receive education would prefer to move to big cities or even overseas where more opportunities and higher pay await. Thus, there will be an overly large class sizes and high average number of students per teacher in a school. Moreover, the teachers are usually those unqualified with few teaching aids and poor textbook provision. Due to this, children attending schools in rural areas usually attain poorer results in standardized tests compared to their urban counterparts. This can be seen in the reports given by the Northern and Eastern Africa Consortium for Monitoring Educational Quality. Those taking the tests in rural areas score much lower than those in small towns and big cities. This shows a lack of equal education opportunity given to children from different parts of the same country. With teachers being less qualified than others in urban areas, the teaching-to-learning environment takes an effect amongst the students. In one instance, teachers took the same test as their students and 3/4 of them had failed. In addition, those that do not receive the same education to those in the bigger cities have trouble even after graduation with reading, writing, and doing math. Students who do not attain the same equal education to those in urban environments do not achieve the same outcome in establishing success with her career. With education being a major concern towards achieving a career and establishing a future, Africa needs to be aware that equal education needs to be established within all schools throughout the countries. Emigration. Next, emigration leads to a loss of highly educated people and financial loss. The loss of skilled people can only be replaced with another huge cost, which imply the loss of money spent educating people who leave and new people to replace them. Even though an almost 5.5% of GDP investment in education, the loss makes it difficult for the government to budget another amount in education, as they will need to prioritize other needs such as military budget and debt servicing. Military and conflict. Military spending is causing education spending to decrease immensely. According to a March 2011 report by UNESCO, armed conflict is the biggest threat to education in Africa. While the number of dropouts across the continent has been increasing dramatically, one of the influences of war and conflict on education is the diversion of public funds from education to military spending. An already underfunded system is losing more money. 21 African countries have been identified as the highest spenders of gross domestic products on military globally compared with the amount directed toward education. Military and conflict also leads to the displacement of children. It often forces them to remain in camps or flee to their neighboring countries where education is not available to them. In Kenya, after disputed national elections in December 2007, civil unrest displaced over 250,000 people and affected a total of 500,000 persons. The Ministry of Education statistics indicate 62,848 of primary school-going children were affected by the ensuing violence. Influential initiatives. Initiatives to improve education in Africa include Intracontinental NEPADZ School Program is an ambitious plan to provide internet and computer facilities to all schools on the continent. SACMEQ is a consortium of 15 ministries of education in southern and eastern Africa which undertakes integrated research and training activities to monitor and evaluate the quality of basic education, and generates information that can be used by decision-makers to plan and improve the quality of education. For 10 years, the Benin Education Fund has provided scholarships and education support to students from the Atakora province in northeastern Benin. Over 450 students have been able to stay in school because of their programs. International She's the First is a New York City, New York-based non-profit organization. The organization seeks to empower girls in Asia, Africa, and Latin America by facilitating the sponsorship of their education through creative and innovative means, working through local organizations. The African Children's Educational Trust is supporting thousands of youngsters with long-term scholarships and a community rural elementary schools building program. It has built 7 schools to date and is raising funds for more. British Airways project, which, in collaboration with UNICEF, opened the model school Kuj Science Primary School in Nigeria in 2002. The Elias Fund provides scholarships to children in Zimbabwe to get a better education. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community, in association with Humanity First, an international charity organization, has built over 500 schools in the African continent and is running a Learn a Skill initiative for young men and women. Fast Track Initiative. The Volkswagen Foundation has been running a funding initiative called Knowledge for Tomorrow, cooperative research projects in sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2003, it provides scholarships for young African researchers and helps to establish a scientific community in African universities. Corruption in education. A 2010 Transparency International report, with research gathered from 8,500 educators and parents in Ghana, Madagascar, Morocco, Niger, Senegal, Sierra Leone and Uganda, found that education is being denied to African children in incredibly large numbers. A lack of parent involvement, especially as an overseer of government activities, also leads to enormous corruption. This was most often found to be because parents and communities feel as though they lack any kind of power in regard to their child's education. In Uganda, only 50% of parents believe that they have the power to influence decisions regarding the education of their child. In Morocco, just 20% of parents believe they held any sort of power. The unavailability and incompleteness of records in schools and districts prevents the documentation and prevention of corrupt practices. The African Education Watch conducted surveys all over the continent and identified the 3 most common practices of corruption. Illegal collection of fees. One part of their research focused on so-called registration fees. Parents from every country surveyed reported paying even though, by law, primary schooling is free. The report found that the number of parents forced to pay these illegal accounting fees ranged from 9% in Ghana to 90% in Morocco. An average of 44% of parents still report paying skill fees in the study. The average fee cost $4.16, a major expense for families in countries like Madagascar, Niger and Sierra Leone. Embezzlement of school funds. In the study, Transparency International found that 64% of the schools surveyed on the continent published no financial information at all. Power abuse. Another major problem is incompetent management. The report found that in many schools the little resources they did have were being wasted or lost. Overall, 85% of schools across all countries had either deficient accounting systems or none at all. In Morocco, just 23% of head teachers received training in financial management, despite being responsible for budgets. The T report found that there was sexual abuse in schools from teachers. The T report also found that many schools were plagued by teacher absenteeism and alcoholism. Without this basic education, the report found it was nearly impossible to go on to high school or college. African children are missing this link that allows them to have a chance in trade or to go beyond their villages. NGO Involvement. A report by USAID and the Bureau for Africa, Office of Sustainable Development, found that NGOs are increasingly participating and contribute to the delivery of education services, education policy decisions, and are included by donors and government officials in many parts of the education system. Of course, this varies country to country and region to region. NGOs working in education in Africa often encountered tension and competition when working. Schools, parents and, most often, government officials feel threatened by third-party involvement and feel that they're crashing the party. The report continues that for NGOs to be effective, they must understand that they do not have the same perspective as government officials as to who is in control. If they do not recognize the government of the country they are working in, they will compromise their objectives. The report goes into more detail about NGO relations with governments in education. The relationship is viewed from completely separate points. African governments see NGOs and their work as an affair of government, or, in other words, working as a part and in collaboration with the country's government. NGOs, on the other hand, view themselves as very separate entities in African education. They see themselves fulfilling moral responsibility. They believe that they are identifying needs or areas of development in situations under which the government has ultimately been unaccountable in, separately mobilizing resources toward those needs or development areas. Government and NGOs hold contrasting beliefs about each other's abilities. Governments often think NGOs are unqualified to make important policy decisions and that they could undermine their legitimacy if seen as superior. In some cases, NGOs have found government incompetent themselves, if not their own fault, as the fault of a lack of resources. In the best cases, NGOs and government officials find each other's mutual strengths in education policy and find ways to practically collaborate and reach both of their objectives. To be effective in education in Africa, NGOs must affect policy and create policy changes that support their projects. NGOs also found that, to see this policy change that they are striving for, they must create and foster relationships with many different stakeholders. The most important stakeholders are usually donors and government officials. The biggest challenge for NGOs has been linking these networks together. NGO interventions to change policy have revealed that NGO programs have failed to create a successful way to change the policy process while making sure that the public understands and is a part of education policy. This problem will prove more influential in the future if it is not solved.